Hi, I'm going to be talking to you about the psychological effects of electronic devices on teenagers, which was the topic of a talk that I recently gave to a conference of pediatricians in Michigan, and thought it might be of more general interest to lots of folks. To give an overview of what this talk is about, the general concept is that human beings have a set of fundamental motives, and that these unfold over the course of development. And here they're displayed in our rebuilt Maslow's pyramid, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And the idea is that these fundamental motives are normally adaptive, but that they can be parasitized by modern technology. I'm going to be talking today about some ideas in this book, which I wrote with my son, Dave Lundberg-Kenrick, who works at ASU on a program that's called Psych for Life, in which he deals with the question of how can psychological findings be applied to address everyday life problems. And we wrote this book because the two of us have spent a lot of time, walking and biking around together and kind of pondering the question of how research in psychology can help us, raise his younger brother, who's the kid here with the longer hair, and my two grandchildren, his children, the other two kids in the picture. And how can we help them survive and thrive? Is there anything in the psychology literature that would educate that process? And these are three kids who are really remarkably bright and healthy. But sometimes when I look at them, I think these kids aren't going to make it. And part of the problem that I see for these kids' lives is that some of the biggest obstacles to their lives come from electronic devices that were originally designed to help them, but that are now parasitizing them. So a little bit of background. A recent study in JAMA Pediatrics looked at the amount of screen time that 5,412 12 and 13-year-olds had. And what they found in a previous study, they had found that it was close to 4 hours a day these kids are spending on screens. But then after the onset of COVID, that went up to, to closer to 8 hours a day. So it doubled. Another statistic from Pew is that if you ask teenagers, do you check your phone the first thing after you wake up? A surprisingly high percentage of them say yes, and often. And I mentioned this to one of my graduate students, and the response was, well, doesn't everybody? And it occurs to me that I also do. So it's not like adults are immune to these kinds of problems. In fact, a lot of the points I'm going to talk about apply not just to teenagers. But so in this book, we discuss, again, this general idea how the set of fundamental, powerful motives that we inherited from our ancestors can be out of sync with the demands of the current world. And there's really two ways in which this happens. First of all, some of the problems we confront are completely novel. They're not the same problems our ancestors confronted, and our minds are not necessarily ready for them. The other thing is that some of the things that the technologies that we have invented to make our lives easier are, as I pointed out before, actually being used to parasitize these once adaptive systems. And the ideas in this book follow from two earlier books that I did, in which I talk about the research in evolutionary psychology that I've conducted with my students and colleagues over the last several decades. And so I'm going to start with a 10-minute crash course in evolutionary social psychology as we do it at ASU. And there's a lot more information about that in these two books. But the basic premise that we begin with is one that we all learned about in high school biology: natural selection. Animals that have features that are suited to the environments they live in are going to survive better than those who do not have those kinds of well-adapted features. And importantly, from an evolutionary perspective, the well-adapted, well-designed organisms are going to reproduce more successfully. Now, this has some implications for psychology, which should be obvious, but weren't obvious for a very long time. If an animal has a particular kind of a body that's adapted to doing a particular kind of a thing, they require brain mechanisms to run those bodies efficiently. And sometimes those are different. Not all brains are the same. So for example, bats, like whales and porpoises, use echolocation to navigate around in a poor, visual world where there's very little light, very little clarity. That they don't see the world that we do. In fact, they don't have color vision, but what they do have is they do have mechanisms for echolocation. One of the concepts that's fairly critical to an evolutionary approach to human behavior is this idea of modularity and domain specificity. And the idea is that the brain is not just one big reward-seeking organ, which is what we used to think about it, but instead it's a number of partially independent subsystems that are dealing with different kinds of problems. And the support for the modularity assumption comes from a number of areas. Classically, it comes from neuroscientific evidence, such as the discovery that there are certain areas of the brain, like Wernicke's area, which if there's damage to that, an individual has a hard time understanding speech. They can produce speech, but it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. Damage to Broca's area makes it so that the person has a hard time producing speech, even though they can understand speech just perfectly. Now, not all of the brain's mechanisms are as spatially located, like one of these old butcher's diagrams of a cow. Some of them are distributed in different areas of the brain, but the idea is that there are different systems in the brain. Some other support for that idea comes from studies of other animals that indicate that some of the kinds of problems that animals need to think about, and some of the things that they need to remember, are actually functionally incompatible with one another. So Clark's nutcracker stores thousands of seeds in different locations, and after he eats one of these seeds, then he erases the memory of that particular location. And this ability to remember these thousands of different locations persists throughout the nutcracker's lifespan. Song learning, on the other hand, works in a very different way. Rather than thousands of different things learned throughout the life, it's only learned a specific kind of information. The bird's song is learned during a very critical period. And once it's learned, it lasts a lifetime. And often it requires absolutely no practice. So it's not like other kinds of learning. And there are several different kinds of learning in other animals and also in human beings. And so when it comes to thinking about other people, the assumption is that instead of, again, a monolithic brain that's run by a single reward-seeking self, get rewards from other people, instead, it's better to think of us as having a number of subcells located in there in our brain. And each of these subcells or functional systems is designed to process a different kind of information. We think of it in terms of what we call fundamental motivational systems. And the concept behind this is that all human beings throughout all of our evolutionary history have faced a recurring set of problems in their relationships with other people. One of them is we needed to form bonds with friends. Anthropologists tell us that people living in hunter-gatherer or early horticultural environments, if they didn't share, they would not have survived. And so our ancestors were good at forming friends. They also needed to protect themselves from bad guys, from other people who were going to come over the hill and try to, burn down the village and rape and pillage. Status, also, there's mechanisms for this. It was adaptive to be not looked down upon by your fellow group members, and to be looked up upon carried certain advantages. Seeking a mate. every single one of our ancestors was successful at least once in seeking a mate, or we would not be here to talk about it. But seeking mates is not the same as retaining mates. And not all organisms, in fact, do care about retaining their mates. In fact, not even most mammals, 96% of mammals don't care about retaining their mates, but human beings are in a very small set that do. And then offspring care, something that all mammals do, but it's also something that we have, humans are specialized for in different ways. Now, the idea is that within each of those problem domains, there should be different kinds of cognitive biases, that what works, the way that you share resources with strangers on the marketplace doesn't work when you're talking about romantic relationships. And it doesn't at all work when you're talking about family relationships in which there's not, reciprocity. You don't expect your children to pay you back for all the resources that you gave to them in the way that you would a business partner. So various kinds of biases in each of these domains has been studied by psychologists for the last several decades. I'll just mention a couple of them to you. When it comes to affiliation, it's easier for us to cooperate with individuals who share our genes. Okay, in fact, even in modern North American society, when you ask people who's closest to you, they very frequently nominate a close relative. It's also easy to share resources with people with whom we've developed a reciprocal exchange relationship, with whom we've exchanged resources in the past. When it comes to status, having status has costs, but it also brings certain kinds of benefits. And for reasons related to what evolutionary biologists call differential parental investment and sexual selection, males are going to be more likely to take extreme risks to gain and maintain status, because males, in addition to getting whatever other benefits they get, a good position at the water hole and good resources, which both males and females get, males also can attract mates by having higher status. Parental care or familial care, when parents share resources with offspring, they don't use the same rules, as I noted before, that they use with strangers or even with their romantic partners. And within the family, the way that relatives share with one another. So there's often conflict between parents and children, because parents are related to every one of their biological offspring in the same way. They share 50% of their genes. And siblings share 50% of their genes with one another, but they also share 100% of their genes with themselves, which leads to a conflict of interest. They would rather see, it's not that they want their brothers and sisters to get nothing, but they would like to see themselves get just a little bit of extra. And another kind of a bias is that a lot of families are mixed, and there'll be biological children and stepchildren. And although human beings are pretty good at getting along with their step relatives, research suggests that there is a lot more channeling of parental resources to biological children than to stepchildren. So in the approach that we take in our lab, what we do is we activate different kinds of motives. So we may show people a scary movie, or we may show them a romantic movie. And then we may look at how that activating feelings about mating or self-protection influences what they pay attention to. Do you look at different people in a crowded room, depending upon what motivational state you're in? And to study that, we've used eye trackers. We look at how long people stay on each of these different faces, and does that change when they're feeling frightened or when they're feeling romantic or status concerns. How do people interpret ambiguous facial expressions? Okay, how do they encode all kinds of information in the social world? Is this woman flirting? Is she angry? Is she just sort of staring off into the distance? And your answer to that question may depend upon which of your motives is activated. Do you remember different people depending upon what motivational state you're in? So was this face in the crowd that you saw just a minute ago? Your answer, your ability to remember a face of a man or a woman may depend upon your motivational state. This guy, incidentally, was not in the crowd that you saw a minute ago. Another thing that we've studied is behavioral economic biases. So one of them is something called loss aversion. It feels it's more psychologically impactful to lose $100 than to gain $100. And this is something that's called loss aversion. But what we've studied is how does loss aversion move around as a function of what motivational state you are in. In fact, in a romantic frame of mind, for example, men don't show any loss aversion whatsoever. So these motives, we assume, are functionally tuned, okay? They're systems that are designed to turn on and turn off as a function of biologically relevant factors, such as your age, okay? These systems click on and develop at different phases of your life. Your sex, males and females, have slightly different approaches to several of these motives. Your mating strategy. Some people engage in a relatively faster mating strategy. Others use a slower mating strategy, a sort of monogamous, one person at a time and maybe for a whole lifetime. Do you have children? That can change which motivational states are active. And then finally, what are the threats and opportunities in your current environment? And those can turn on or turn off these fundamental motives. Our ideas here are based on a biological theory called life history theory. And the assumption is that in some sense, all organisms are kind of economists in a sense that they're going through life trying to maximize their utility. And the idea is that what life is it's building a caloric bank account. And the first phase for all animals is what's called somatic effort. It's just basically building your body. For humans, that takes a dozen years before you even begin to move on to the next phase, which is beginning to spend those resources in seeking mates, and then in human beings and other mammals, parenting. Okay. Now, thinking about Maslow's classic pyramid in terms of life history theory led us to sort of revise the pyramid in a way. So here's the classic pyramid, which has self-actualization at the top, but it does have immediate physiological needs, then safety, then some social motives, and then the need for esteem. And then Maslow believed that self-actualization was possibly a non-social motive, a desire to go off and, do art or music by yourself. And our model basically says that, well, that original formulation doesn't take into account the fact that our ancestors probably didn't survive and reproduce by deciding to go off after they'd accomplished getting status in their groups, to go off and be by themselves and write poetry. But even being by yourself, even writing poetry probably serves other functions, such as mate acquisition or getting status. And then, of course, there's, after you acquire mates, you need to retain and parent the offspring. Okay, so when we originally published this idea, it kind of went, viral very quickly. There was an article published in a magazine called Miller McCune. It's now the Pacific Standard, and that got picked up by the New York Times as the idea of the day. And then there was another article in the New York Times Magazine on this, which talked about this research. And one thing that I will point out is that the readers of the New York Times, who I would normally regard as my reference group, they weren't all as overly receptive to this idea as others. So here's a quote from a guy named Garth from the Berkshires. he refers to this new pyramid as breeder-centric tyranny. Not everyone wishes to spawn and be a parent. Somebody named Lola from Europe said, I have not bred, nor do I feel the need to breed. This is not a fundamental drive for me. I do feel the desire to self-actualize. Does this make me out of date or unevolved? And in fact, even the ASU administration received nasty letters saying, how dare they, mess with Maslow's sacred pyramid and, tear self-actualization off the top of the pyramid. One of the more humorous responses came from this Jezebel website, in which the author basically said that as a childless person, I don't buy that all of our achievements are linked in one way or another to the urge to reproduce, which is something I got from the New York Times. And then they said that while Kenrick tries to link human behavior to animal urges, he's forgotten one very human characteristic, the drive to buy. And so Jezebel created her own hierarchy that had various kind of articles that we would purchase as we moved higher and higher in life, till finally the pinnacle was a treehouse. But now, to return kind of more seriously to this topic, Maslow, first of all, Maslow never used his sacred pyramid. Someone else, a business psychologist, actually invented it. He didn't disagree with it, but it wasn't his formulation originally. And in fact, Maslow was an early evolutionary psychologist, but he came in to the game. He believed in modularity. In fact, that was his big argument for the hierarchy of motives, that it wasn't all just about seeking reward through, food and thirst and so forth. He argued there are other kinds of specialized motives that humans have, which we would agree with. He did place self-actualization as sort of above social motives, but we've actually found in some of the research I've done with some of my colleagues that status and affiliation are very importantly linked up with people's desire to, self-actualize, to develop their highest potential. So we don't throw away self-actualization. We just think it's related to other kinds of motives in this perspective. Maslow was in fact an early advocate of what we would now call positive psychology. And in fact, a lot of modern positive psychologists would argue that human thriving in the modern world can be enhanced by understanding where we came from, by understanding the evolutionary past. And in fact, in this book, that's the premise, that we basically use this pyramid to sort of organize the problems that ancestral humans had to solve over the lifespan, and to talk about how they can break down in the modern world. And then we offer some suggestions for solving those modern problems. One of the things we talk about in there, returning to this idea of robo-parasites, is, that again, they're, if nature is this sort of economic exchange of resources, when any organism accumulates resources or exchanges resources, that creates an opportunity for parasites. And modern technology actually allows for very efficient parasitism. We have these powerful motives. There are things we really want, that we really want to pay for, okay, that we really want to invest a lot of energy in. And so that offers an opportunity for individuals to either, to basically to take some of those resources. And biologists talk about 4 kinds of parasitism. And one of them is, a reasonable one, symbiotic mutualism. The clownfish and the sea anemone both get things from one another. So they have a symbiotic relationship. It's a form of what we might call mutual parasitism. Commensalism is like with a pilot fish and a shark. Some fish swim along with sharks and just pick up some of the scraps. They don't really cost the shark very much at all. and sometimes they cost the shark nothing. Microparasitism, on the other hand, is just biting a little teeny bit off your prey, as mosquitoes do. But then there's extreme forms of parasitism, which completely steal the host's reproductive potential, like cuckoos who lay their eggs in warblers' nests. And here's, you see this adult warbler who is feeding a baby cuckoo, not realizing that, in fact, it's investing in a cuckoo's offspring and not its own. So what I'm going to do is go through each of those different motives in our new pyramid and talk about how the motivational systems, how they work and how they get exploited. So at the bottom of the pyramid are these basic physiological needs that we all have to satisfy starting from day one, with nursing. We have brain mechanisms that are designed, they were designed to give our ancestors a burst of pleasure when they did something, a survival facilitating choice, beginning at birth when they nursed, okay? Later on in life, when you're thirsty and you drink water, or when you eat calorie-dense foods, you get a burst of pleasure from your brain. And our ancestors, basically, that told our ancestors, do that again. Now, in the modern world, this opens up the opportunity to, we have this powerful need to get these, to get calorie-dense foods. So it opens up opportunities for the food and beverage industry to you could say exploit. I mean, I don't want to say anything bad about Ben and Jerry's. I love them, but they make something we find delicious, but also happens in large doses, not to be good for us. And in the book, we talk about, cases like this, so Elvis Presley reached 350 pounds from his early, very life and, fit. He looked like a very healthy hunter-gatherer when he was 19, 20 years old. But then, he gained a tremendous amount of weight and was famous for eating these, heroes with bacon and, peanut butter and all kinds of, bananas on them. And he actually died of heart disease at a very young age, in his early 40s. Walter Hudson, in the picture below him, he got up to a weight of 1,197 pounds. He was so large that he never left his bed, and he couldn't fit through the door of his bedroom, and spent a couple of decades, I believe, in that same room. And he also, like Elvis, died of heart disease. As I was researching this book and reading some work by anthropologists, I was surprised to find out that heart disease is very rare in hunter-gatherers. Even elderly hunter-gatherers, those who live to 70 or 80, very unlikely to have heart disease. Why? Because they don't get access to Ben and Jerry's and that kind of level of calories, and they move around a lot. They walk several miles every day in pursuit of foods that are, things like berries or, small animals. So they eat a lot of protein, and they don't eat nearly as much carbohydrates. Carbohydrates came into our lives in big doses at the agricultural revolution, when we started to do things like harvest wheat, and there were benefits and costs that came with that. So it turns out that in 2018, over 20% of teenagers were obese, and that is a change from the 1970s. When it was 7 times lower than that. And why is that? Well, it's partially because there's things like, schools for many years, and a lot of them are still doing it. They actually, junk food machines in the school, they do that not to be evil, but because they are underfunded, and the food and beverage industry pays them a share of the profits to put these machines full of Coca-Cola and potato chips in the schools. And then school lunches themselves, because there isn't a tremendously big budget for this, they're often full of foods that are less than perfectly healthy for kids. One of the things that we surveyed a number of students here at ASU and asked them the ways in which electronic technology both helped and hurt them in pursuit of these different kinds of goals. And one of the things that several of them pointed out is that the devices that they carry around with them often actually replace active exercise. So people will play a game in which they walk around in some imaginary environment rather than getting up and walking around in the real environment. What kind of solutions do we have for this? Well, one is a very old and well-established idea from behavioral psychology, the idea of stimulus control, which is that the kind of practical punchline of the idea of stimulus control is that it's a lot easier to control your environment than to resist temptation. When there's Ben and Jerry's sitting in front of you, it's very hard to say no to it, okay? But what we can do is when we go to the supermarket, we can simply not stock up on all these foods that we know we don't want to be eating all the time. Instead, we can buy healthier foods. And, if we have kids, we can fill their lunch boxes with, things like fruits, tasty fruits that they like, and, things that involve more protein. And by making these things, accessible, by making it easy for the kids to find peanut butter and cashew butter, instead of finding just kind of pre-processed junk foods full of carbohydrates, you're basically capitalizing on this principle of stimulus control. Make the healthy food available, make the unhealthy food something they have to work hard for. So at the next step up, developmentally, after kids are done with the nursing period, they start to become concerned about protecting themselves from strangers. And our ancestors were often, threatened by members of other groups, as I noted before. And we are very sensitive to people who might do damage to us, mostly young males. This opens up an opportunity for the modern news industry, which basically delivers threats to us on an hourly basis. If you are, depending upon which side of the political fence you're on, you'll hear, oh my gosh, these people are coming. They're gonna take down the border walls. They're gonna take away our guns. And on the other side, you hear, oh, my goodness, they're going to, basically make it required that teachers carry machine guns into schools. And so there's all kinds of potential threats out there. And politicians make money off this too, by scaring you all the time about what the other side is doing. Meanwhile, big data robots are mining your clicks to figure out exactly which threats are the ones that you find most irresistible, and then giving you more of them in your news feed. It's not the fault of the news industry. It's our fault because it's just like we love to eat Ben and Jerry's. We love to eat bad news. The most popular categories of news in this one analysis of 20 years of news headlines, 5 of the 6 were bad news. War and terrorism at the top, bad weather, human-created disasters, natural disasters, crime and social violence. These are the things we want to read about, okay? And so the media, both on the left and the right and in the middle, is willing to give us that information because that's what they get rewarded for. That's where they place their ads. So solutions, one of the very simple solutions is that both my son, Dave, and I have done is just delete apps that regularly frighten us. I've actually even stopped. I took the New York Times and the Washington Post off my my cell phone because I don't want to be reminded of all those crazy loonies out there that are coming to destroy our country, or that are destroying it from within. So again, developmentally, kids move on, they go to preschool, they start to want to form friendships. And in fact, humans, we have very powerful desires to want to be in groups. My anthropological colleagues, Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado, did a study of the Ache, who are a group of horticulturalists. They do some hunter gathering as well. And these anthropologists analyzed the number of calories that everybody brought in every day. And it turned out that many families would have starved if they had to rely just on themselves, because they have some good times, but then they would have some bad times as well. But by pooling their risk with another group of families, that they would all survive much better. Besides sharing food, humans also help each other find the food in the first place. They teach each other how to fish and to hunt. They teach each other how to prepare food. We have powerful social motives. In fact, feeling disconnected, feeling lonely. Julianne Holt-Lundstad did an analysis of the existing data, and she estimated that the mortality risk from feeling lonely, for being isolated socially, is as high as that for being obese or for smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So now young people have lots of opportunities to make contact with one another, provided by their electronic technology. We've got Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and to some extent that's replaced face-to-face interactions. But a lot of what kids are doing on their phones is they are doing things that are social. Okay, so streaming videos is not social, but multiplayer games and being on social media or texting or video chatting, these are all things that could connect us to other people. Do they work? Jean Twenge has analyzed some data that suggests the answer is not very well. Kids, for example, who spend more time than average on social media are significantly less happy than kids who spend just an average amount of time on social media. On the other hand, kids who spend more time actually in face-to-face interaction with other friends are somewhat significantly happier than kids who don't spend time in face-to-face interaction with other kids. Here's some interesting research. Turns out that amongst 8 to 11-year-olds, already at that age, 50% of them have a smartphone. By the time they reach 12 to 15 years old, that shoots up to 90% of the kids have a smartphone. Over 40% of 8 to 12-year-olds, 8 to 11-year-olds use social media. And that shoots up to, again, close to 90% of 12 to 15-year-olds. And then both the 8 to 11-year-olds and the 12 to 15-year-old groups do spend, they all play games online, about 80% of them. I'm going to return later to what are some other consequences of that. So when you don't have your cell phone, how do you feel? So my son Dave and I sometimes put our cell phones, you turn them off and put them away, and we feel happier without them. And in fact, it turns out that of young boys in one survey, about 17% of them say that they feel happy when they are, without their cell phones. But a slightly larger percentage, 20%, said they feel lonely when they are not around their cell phone. And over 30% said they feel anxious when they are not connected with their cell phone. Girls, similar, but even more extreme. Teenage girls are more likely to feel lonely than boys when they're not connected to their cell phone. And almost 50% of teenage girls say that they feel anxious if they don't have their cell phone. Here's a graph that I believe is from Twenge's article in the Atlantic Monthly, which had the title of something like "How the iPhone Destroyed a Generation." But what is being graphed here, the blue line is graphing loneliness. And what you can see is that loneliness was dropping from 1990 to the early 2000s. But then with the introduction of the cell phone in 2007, loneliness shot back up. Same sort of thing for feeling left out, shot back up once cell phones were introduced. So again, it looks like cell phones, which could be connecting kids with one another, they're not solving that problem of isolation and loneliness. They might even be making it worse. So what kinds of solutions here? What we would recommend is that kids and adults spend more time hanging out with real people with their cell phone turned off. And obviously hang out with real people. When you're young, it means making new friends. And there's a lot of research in social psychology says that one easy way to do that is to find people with similar interests. And in fact, when you meet a new person, to find some similarity with them. People find it it's like chocolate for the mind to find somebody who is similar to you. So status. As kids get older, they begin to become concerned with how people regard them. And, well, they should, because our ancestors, when they did something that helped their small group, or that when they had some accomplishment, they got patted on the back, and that led to a better position in the group, easier access to the water hole, and sometimes better access to mates. So it pays to care about whether people look up to you or look down on you. But computer games basically sort of exploit this by leading people to feel like they're winning all the time. Look at the points that I'm racking up in this game, when in fact they are often just sucking away time that they could be used in real accomplishments. Here's a graph from a study that it's a complicated graph, but it's basically showing you by the day of the week how much time how much time students are spending checking their cell phone, during the hours of time when they could be studying. And then the one down below is basically showing what checking their cell phones while the times when they're in class. And it turns out that students do, and I've seen this in my classes, they'll check their phones sometimes incessantly while they're studying and during classes. When I asked students at Arizona State, when Cameron Bunker and I asked our students to list the benefits and costs of their devices for these different motives, one of the ones that they talked about for status was that they felt that they wasted time that they could use to get ahead with their electronic devices. And is it right for them to be concerned about that? I mean, you could use your electronic devices to, read Wikipedia and to read information. But it turns out that actually a study from a couple of years ago indicated that total smartphone use by students was negatively correlated with their grades, whereas having periods of inactivity when your cell phone was tucked out of the way and turned off was positively correlated with getting good grades in college. So in terms of solutions here, it pays for us to learn. There's lots of time management software out there, some of it which will tell us, basically will remind us that we should spend less time, or in fact limit the amount of time that we spend on particular apps that we know to be wasteful for us. Turns out I just realized the other day that my device has some of those, but it's not really heavily advertised because basically there's not much money in it. Although my suspicion is there's a market out there for some really good time management software that people can, can use effectively. So in the teenage years, people begin to become concerned with acquiring mates. And some of these hookup apps like Tinder are sort of like Ben and Jerry's for the mind's mating module. A young colleague of ours said that she sometimes will be on a date with one guy and think, this guy's okay, but maybe if I look, there's a message from a better guy. So these particular kinds of apps do create the perception that there's a more or less unlimited number of possibilities out there. This is a site that is used by teenagers, both to make friends, but also to find dates. And some interesting factoids about teenage dating. Electronic technology doesn't seem to be helping. Back in 1976, 15% of 12th graders had never dated. In the year 2018, that was almost 50%. So 1 out of 2 high school seniors getting ready to go off to college have never even once dated. So technology isn't necessarily helping them. may not be the only cause of the not dating, but it's certainly a contributor. Another thing that's out there in the electronic world is that you don't even have to bother meeting real people. You can go on a website like RedTube, and I've X'd out these windows because each of the windows here shows a kind of a brief clip from a porno video in which some very attractive people are engaged in some very intimate positions with one another. And you can click on those and have a short-term imaginary experience with no muss, no fuss, and these sites also include like links where one can have phone sex with a complete stranger immediately, like right now. Turns out that 68% of adolescents report having been exposed to online pornography. And for 10% of them, they were identified as at risk for it doing harm to them because they're spending so much time on these sites. Another kind of a downside of electronic technology is that about a quarter of the middle and high school students who are in that group that do date and have relationships during the previous year had been the victim of digital dating abuse. Because so people not only meet their dates, but they also can abuse their dating partners using electronic technology such as social media. One solution that we suggest in the book is to shop locally, rather than try to look at all the people in the whole wide world you could possibly date and all the thousands of possible options out there. Actually think about meeting real people in the real world, people who you and your family and your friends know. And because there's other kinds of abuse that happen from meeting strangers you don't know about. Okay, mate retention. So as I mentioned before, 95% of mammals have no bonds between the mothers and the fathers. But human offspring are very helpless. They have these big heads. They're totally immobile, unlike hoofed animals, which can run around on their own at birth. Our offspring are helpless for at least a couple of years. And those helpless big-headed offspring really benefit from having two cooperating parents. They're more likely to survive in hunter-gatherer and horticultural environments. In the modern world, being in a long-term relationship is also something that we are designed to kind of crave, and they seem to be good for our health. Now, relationships are hard. They involve a lot of compromise and difficulty, and people are kind of biased in the sense of we always think we do more of the housework than our partner does. And one of the things that electronic technology offers are things, websites like this, which is basically saying, life is short, have an affair. And even websites like OkCupid have options for married people to connect with one another. And there's shows like The Bachelor on television that create these perceptions of really an infinite supply of attractive replacements. And this can undermine people's efforts to maintain their relationship commitments. I had originally thought, well, this doesn't have much relevance to teenagers, right? Since most of them aren't even dating. But it turns out that those who are dating, my son Dave had recently interviewed a developmental psychologist here at Tao Ha, who studies adolescent relationships. And she's found that there's a number of problems that teenagers are having with electronic media interfering with their relationships. One of them is, for example, teenage boys liking their girlfriends' friends' bikini pictures on social media. So, a whole new problem in the modern world, and it's sort of the teenage equivalent, I guess, of Ashley Madison. One piece of bad advice that used to get passed around a lot in my generation was, well, you've got to do what's right for yourself when it comes to relationships. Turns out there's pretty good evidence that taking that attitude leads you to have worse relationships, and it's actually not good for you or your partner in the long run. And generally speaking, the best rule is to do what's good for your partner. They'll they'll appreciate you more and get along with you better. So finally, final step of the kind of renovated pyramid is parental care. So every mammal has high parental investment by the females, but as I just pointed out, human males also contribute to their offspring. And we're here because our ancestors took very good care of those helpless kids. But parenting is also hard, and it requires a lot of resources and a lot of attention. And in the modern world, with we're busy, we're doing things as adults. We're checking Ashley Madison and OkCupid, and so we don't have much time. And so we often turn to these devices in order to help us babysit. And one of my TAs, Angelique Craig, pointed out that she calls these devices zombie boxes, because you give them to your kid and the kid is hypnotized. And it's great if you want babysitting when the kid is little, but what I discovered is that as a kid gets older, they want more and more and more time on the screens, and it gets to be more and more of a struggle. It's like you want to take away their devices. It's like taking away, meth from a speed freak. Turns out one survey indicated that American families who spend more than 37 minutes of quality time together every day are actually above average in connectedness. 37 minutes seems to be about the amount of time that we spend actually interacting with our family members. Why? Well, we're busy to some extent on our devices. There was another Pew survey in which parents were asked, do you ever find that your child is distracted during conversation by their cell phones? And some parents said, no, never. Some said rarely. But it turns out that a reasonable number said, yes, often. And another even larger number said, yeah, sometimes. Now, parents, incidentally, the same survey asked teenagers about their parents. And what they found is that parents weren't as bad as teenagers, but a lot of kids did say that their parents were often distracted. And the largest group said that their parents are indeed sometimes distracted by devices when they're trying to have a conversation with them. One solution here, I think, is if you're a parent, it's good to set limits early and to set them consistently. If you're dealing with your own problems with devices, it's important to set limits for yourself. And certainly if you're a parent, you don't want to model electronic addiction to your children. Now, again, as I pointed out before, there's different levels of parasitism, and parasitism isn't always a bad thing. Symbiotic mutualism is a good thing. One organism helps another. And these are devices are not, they're not harmful in and of themselves. When we asked college students about the costs and benefits, we found there were a number of things that they thought were extremely helpful. So for example, getting help from other people in an emergency, it really helps to have one of these things on hand. Communicating with your friends over distance, maintaining relationships over distance, it really helps to have electronic technology. Checking in with your family these are the three things that they thought devices were most helpful for. These are all things that I think we would regard as benefits of electronic technology. And on that note, I am going to say, thank you from me and from all of my genetic descendants.